Okay, well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first of a new series of lectures, Legacies of Colonialism in the Modern World. And just to make the point, we've got a new and original organisation of the Chancellor's Hall, kind of saloon bar style. We will be serving drinks later on, so stick around. We're really excited about this new project. I mean, it won't have escaped your notice that Legacies of Empire is a huge topic in the news at the moment. We hear almost daily about new calls for reparations, compensation, the return of historical artifacts, even human remains. There's debate going on within the academy, within the museum sector, and way beyond. And, you know, indeed, we've seen recently the Windrush scandal, the kind of aftermath of the Windrush scandal. It's forced us to look at what happened to nationality laws, how those have kind of been affected by Britain's imperial past, and indeed, Brexit itself, many people would say, reflects the kind of aftermath of empire and imperial nostalgia. And indeed, next week, and I hope you'll be able to come, we have Sally Tomlinson, who is the co-author of the book Will Britannia Brexit and the End of Empire, going to be talking about precisely that. We've got some really interesting speakers lined up later in the programme. Sarah Gandhi talking about the legacies of the Indian Criminal Tribes Act, Amelia Gentleman, who helped to break the Windrush scandal in The Guardian, coming talking to us, papers on German colonial reparations later on in the year. But we're absolutely delighted to kick this series off and really get it going, to have Robert Gildea from Worcester College, Oxford, with us, who's a distinguished historian of France and European history, moving apparently into British history now with a new project on the miners' strike, which is fascinating. But Robert's best known as a historian of the kind of legacies of the French Revolution, the resistance movements in France and elsewhere in the Second World War, the events of 1968 in France. And most recently, his book Empires of the Mind, which is brilliant, and I would encourage you to read, which is subtitled The Colonial Past and the Politics of the Present, and looks at Britain and France. So it's precisely the sort of thing that we're dealing with in this series. So, Robert, I think we'll take questions afterwards, but I'd like to invite him to speak, and thank him very much for coming to the horses.
Well, thank you, Philip, for that very warm welcome. It's a great pleasure to be here. I was reminiscing earlier that I gave my first seminar paper in the Institute of Historical Research. It must have been about 1978 or 9, so it's been a long slog, but it's been a very enjoyable one. So thank you to Philip, and thank you to the Institute for inviting me. As you said, there's been much talk about the legacy of empire and of colonialism, but one of my colleagues, Carmen Abulsi, she's a political scientist of Palestinian origin, said, you must not have the title legacy, the word legacy, at the title of your book. And I said, what's wrong with that? She said, because a legacy implies that something is over, that the person who's made the legacy is dead. And she said, empire is not dead. And this is really what I'm talking about today. My argument is that empire is dead only in the sense of the formal empire, the territorial empires that were founded by the European powers basically between 1880 and 1960. But otherwise, empire is not dead, and in two really important ways. First of all, there is still an imperial reflex that prompts former imperial and colonial powers to behave as if they were still imperial powers, with a global reach as independent powers, and which leads them to repeatedly reinvent colonial aggression. And the second main reason that empires aren't dead is that there are enduring colonial hierarchies based on an attitude of superiority of white to non-white peoples, both out there in the wider world, but also back here in the metropolis. Now, I call these empires of the mind because they are fantasies or illusions about power and superiority, although they have real and lethal consequences. And my main point is that empire needs to be thought through if we are not to continually repeat past mistakes or to reinforce dubious hierarchies. So my talk is divided into three parts. The empire is still out there, the empire is still back here, and lastly, the empire and Europe. So my first point is that struggle and opposition in the colonial sphere provoked reinvention of empire in different forms. So the virtual loss of empire in the Second World War provoked what William Roger Louis and Ronald Robinson called the imperialism of decolonisation. So, for example, the British lost Singapore in 1942, that's the picture on the left. They lost India in 1947 and Palestine in 1948, but they held on to much of the Middle East, particularly Egypt, and they also held on to East Africa and through the Commonwealth of South Africa. France lost most of its empire during the Second World War to the Japanese, to the British, and to a civil war that fought over empire between the Vichy and Free French. But France was liberated in 1944 from its empire, particularly from North Africa, and it was not going to lose it again. It did lose Indochina in 1954, that's Bien Bien Phu, but for that reason, they were damned if they were going to lose Algeria, which was regarded as actually part of metropolitan France, and they fought a long war between 54 and 62 to keep hold of it. Now, formal independence was this is Dien Bien Phu on the left, and a picture of the Algerian bodies from the Algerian War. Formal independence obviously was granted to by most colonial powers in the 1960s, and this is what people know as decolonisation. But the former colonial powers retained military, strategic and economic control over former colonies in what was known as NeoColonialism. The French version of this was called France-Afrique, and here is a picture of General de Gaulle, an African leader, and in the middle, a rather gloomy-looking character who was called Jacques Foccart. And he was de Gaulle's Secretary General for African and Malagasy Affairs, nicknamed Monsieur Afrique. He advised, in inverted commas, from his office in the Élysée Palace, governments of new states. He backed them against opposition if they towed the French line, and if they didn't, they were very rapidly dumped. The picture on the left is of Harry Oppenheimer, who was chair of De Beers Mines in the Anglo-American Corporation, Oxford educated. His huge investments in South Africa and other parts of Africa were protected by the failure of Britain and the United States, notably, to enforce UN sanctions against the apartheid regime. Other examples of neo-colonialism, I think you can see the Northern Ireland secured in the Troubles by soldiers back from colonial duty, and other late imperial manifestations of military power, the Falklands War in 1982, and the French brutal intervention in New Caledonia in 1988. Now we go on to a new phase in the 1970s and 80s, because the oil crisis of 1973 made a huge difference. It gave a sort of fillip to much of the global south. Countries like Algeria, which newly independent, were involved in industrialising, import substitution, planned and semi-socialist economies, so they were becoming more important and threatening to tip the balance of power against the North. And one response to that was the Washington Consensus of the World Bank and IMF, largely controlled by the United States and the G7, which used the lever of third world debt to force privatisation and to force open trade and investment to multinational companies in these developing parts of the world. They also supported local governments to crush opposition by proxy, and I'll give you one example: the Mexican government crushing the Zapatista Liberation Army of Subcomandante Marcos, seen here on the right, in the 1990s. Now, a huge difference was made by the arrival of global Islamism after 1979, which arguably produced a new phase of imperialism. So here we have the Iranian Revolution, the Iranian Islamic Republic in 1971, which was very much a response to the which overthrew the United States-backed Shah regime. On the right we have a picture of the Mujahideen driving the Soviets out of Afghanistan in the 1980s, and then fanning out to Chechnya, Bosnia and Algeria, which descended into civil war in the 1990s. The response of this was a new imperialism led by the United States, the Gulf War of 1991. You remember Samuel Huntington's notion of the clash of civilizations? Well, here it is in reality. This, as you know, provoked what somebody called the blowback, the emergence of Al-Qaeda, which wreaked havoc on American installations and led to 9/11. And of course 9/11 prompted the US and British invasions of Afghanistan in 2001 and Iraq in 2003. France actually stayed out of that war, although it did get involved in Haiti. But Blair said to Bush famously, I will be with you, whatever. And this war was legitimated as a war on terror and a war on the axis of evil, but I think in many ways it can be seen as a revival of old imperialisms. So, for example, this is an article by Michael Ignatieff in the New York Times, which says America's entire war on terror is an exercise in imperialism. This may come as a shock to Americans who don't like to think of their country as an empire. But what else can you call America's legions of soldiers, spooks, and special forces straddling the globe? And there's another way in which one could talk about the revival of empire. This is the view of a man called Sadiq from the Baghdad Antiquities Service, and this is his response to the British bombing of Baghdad in 2003. He says, it's the British again. They have been bombing my family for over 80 years now. 4 generations have lived and died with these unwanted visitors from Britain who come to pour explosives on us from the skies. It first began in 1920. This is the time of the British mandate in Iraq. I often wonder how they would feel if we had been bombing them in England every now and again, from one generation to the next, if we changed their government when it suited us. They say that the imperial era is over. It does not feel that way when you hear the staccato crack of fireballs from the air, and it's then that you dream of real freedom, inshallah, freedom from the RAF. So this offensive in Iraq, the destruction of the US-British occupation of Iraq and the destruction of the Iraqi state, produced again more blowback in the forms of the 7/7 bombings in London and the banlieue riots in France in 2005. And here is a message sent by the leader of the 7/7 bombings in London, Mohammed Siddiqui Khan, who says, your democratically elected governments continually perpetrate atrocities against my people all over the world, and your support of them makes you directly responsible, just as I am directly responsible for protecting and avenging my Muslim brothers and sisters. Until we feel security, you will be our targets, and until you stop the bombing, gassing, and imprisonment and torture of my people, we will not stop the fight. We are at war, and I am a soldier. Now you will taste the reality of the situation. I'm not excusing this, I'm just explaining the logic behind things that former colonial powers did in the name of the new imperialism and the blowback effect. In a sense, and this was going on. So, for example, there were US and French airstrikes in Iraq and Syria in August and September 2014, which led to the beheadings of hostages and to the Charlie Hebdo attack of January 2015. And this is a message led by the leader of the Charlie Hebdo massacre, Amadei Coulibaly, who was of Malian origin. The Kouachi brothers were of Algerian origin, and it's very interesting to trace. You know, you can see the ripples of colonial oppression coming back through the these attacks. He describes himself, Koulibaly describes himself as a soldier of the caliphate. You attack the Islamic State, we will attack you. You are bombing regularly over there. Similarly, French attacks on Raqqa in Syria in October 2015 provoked the Bataclan attacks of the same month. And one could also see that the British and American attacks on Mosul and Raqqa in March 2017 provoked attacks in London, 22nd of March and 23rd of June, and in Manchester on the 26th of May 2014. Now, these connections were not made in the press at the time. I think the only reference I came across indirectly was from Jeremy Corbyn. But what I'm arguing is that continued imperial aggression out there provokes jihadist responses in metropolitan countries. Now, I want to talk a bit about the fact that despite all these attacks, which were the equivalent of the sort of 19th century sending in the gunboats, Britain and France had very different responses to the way in which their imperial reach was declining. And this is this is during the election campaign of 2017. Emmanuel Macron describes colonialism as a crime against humanity, a real barbarity. He says it is a past that we must confront squarely and apologise to those we have harmed. And when I read this, I was quite flabbergasted, and I didn't know whether this was just a kind of political tactic, a kind of gesture, or whether he really meant it. And I think to some extent it was a political tactic, because the picture on the right shows Macron in Mali in May 2017 supporting French forces there who are putting down jihadist networks. Nevertheless, the fact that he said this says something. I want to talk about, we have mentioned Imperial Nostalgia, and there is a question of what Imperial Nostalgia represents in France. I think it's less obvious in France. It's most obvious among the population of the so-called Pieds Noirs, those Algerian settlers who came back to live in France after Algeria gained its independence in 1962. And here we have the case of Robert Ménard, who was of Pieds Noir origin. He became mayor of Béziers in the south of France in 2015, and he renamed a street. Now, a street in his town had been dedicated to the Evian Agreement of the 19th of March 1962. There are lots of streets in France called the 19th of March 1962, and these are supposed to mark the end of the Algerian War as a good thing. But for the Pieds Noirs population, that agreement is seen to be a capitulation, an abandonment of Algeria. And so Robert Ménard renamed the street in honour of somebody called Élie Denois de Saint-Marc, complicated name, but this guy, he was in the French resistance, he was a professional soldier after the war, and he was part of the general's putsch in Algiers in 1961 that tried to stop de Gaulle decolonising Algeria. But my point, I think, is that I don't think imperial nostalgia is that widespread in France. In Britain, I think it's different. And there's a famous poll of 2014 that found that 59% of respondents in the UK thought that the British Empire was, quote, something to be proud of. Only 19% said it was a source of shame, and 34% wished that Britain had its empire back. And I think during the referendum campaign, as Philip has said, this played into the campaign. Here we have Boris Johnson on empire, February 2016. We used to run the biggest empire the world has ever seen. Are we really unable to do trade deals? Well, that kind of rhetoric has been cooled down a bit, but I think this year will show whether we really are able to do trade deals. And I just want to say a couple of things about how I think empire, or thoughts about empire, or empires of the mind, if you like, played into the referendum. There were various notions of what this means. So there's this notion of the swashbuckling, trading, successful buccaneer nation of the 21st century, which David Cameron alluded to among others, but he said this was going to be within the EU. Fat chance. here we have our friend again, Boris Johnson. I won't read this out because it's quite long, but it's basically about the nostalgia for the Anglosphere, which was basically what used to be called Greater Britain, or the white dominions of the Commonwealth, the white Commonwealth countries, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and apartheid South Africa. And he says that, you know, why there was a case of an Australian nurse being found in the country, and he says, no, we shouldn't do this. We British are more deeply connected with the Australians culturally and emotionally than with any other country on earth. That's from 2013. And then there was a lot of debate about what the empire, there was talk about Empire 2.0, and what was this? Philip talks about it in his book, and it's obviously, but on top, what I would argue is that on top of nostalgia for the Dominions, there's also there's a nostalgia for the British Raj, and there have been endless films and series about the Raj, and this is just one of them that came out in 2015, Indian Summers, and there you can see, as it were, everyone in their place. Now, whether empire mattered for ordinary people, I will come back to at the end of the lecture. I just want to get on to the second part of the lecture, which is about empire back here, empire not being over, but back here in Britain, and indeed in France. Now, basically, after the Second World War, colonial subjects who had fought in the imperial armies or were invited to rebuild the motherland were joined by others who came to escape the violence of partition, persecution, and economic dislocation. And this was called Colonising in Reverse by Jamaican-born singer Louise Bennett. And she talks about how these people are now coming to Britain, and she calls it colonising in reverse. But the question that she asks in the end is, are the English people who faced the war and braved the worst? I'm wondering how they're going to stand colonisation in reverse. And I think one would argue that colonisation in reverse was not easy to digest by the host countries for a couple of powerful reasons. First, arguably, it was felt as an ever-present reminder of the loss of empire, an inversion of greatness, heightening a sense in Britain that the Second World War had been squandered, the victory of the Second World War had been squandered, and heightening a sense in France that the Algerian War had indeed been lost. But also, I think the colonisation was felt as a, quote, invasion or a swamping of the country by non-white peoples from the colonies that had been lost. I tried to find a picture of Lincolnshire MP Cyril Osborne. I was unable to find a picture of him, but this is what he said in 1955. This is a white man's country, and I want it to remain so. 20 odd years later, this is what Mrs. Thatcher said. If we went on as we are, then by the end of the century there will be 4 million people of the new Commonwealth or Pakistan here. Now that is an awful lot, and I think it means that people are really rather afraid that this country might be rather swamped by people with a different culture. Now, how was this dealt with? What I would argue was this felt threat was dealt with in a number of ways. The first way was to close frontiers, to restrict immigration. Secondly, it was dealt with by effective segregation. So here we have a wonderful picture which I really wanted on the front cover of my book, but the publisher didn't like it. Here's a wonderful picture of a Caribbean man looking for lodgings, and you can just, the look in that woman's eye says it all. So we have the development of sort of ghettos or banlieues in the French case. This threat was also dealt with by what you might see as the reimposition of colonial hierarchies. There were things that were called at the time colour bars, both in housing, in education, in jobs, which basically asserted the superiority of the homegrown people against the people of immigrant origin. And the third way in which this threat was dealt with, arguably, was the cultivation of monocultural rather than multicultural values, and also of the development or the cult of what you might call a continuous history of the white nation. In Britain, this was called Our Island Story. In France, it was called the Roman National, the national novel, the national story. And this inevitably excluded the colonial other. Here we have a quote from Enoch Powell, which sums up a lot of this thinking. This is to the Society of St. George in April 1964. It talks about this sentimental rustic wonderland is embodied in three enduring principles of Englishness: its unity under the Crown and Parliament, its historical continuity, and its racial homogeneity. And I'll come back to these three factors later on. But the French version of this was developed a bit later by Jean-Marie Le Pen, who emerges as the leader of the Front National. And his big breakthrough was in 1984 when he appeared on a French TV program. And he says a similar thing about Frenchness. He says, I apply a sort of hierarchy of sentiments and preferences. I prefer my daughters to my cousins to my neighbours, those I don't know to my enemies. Consequently, I prefer French people and have every right to do so. After that, I prefer Europeans, then Westerners, and as far as other countries in the world are concerned, I prefer France's allies and those who like her. This seems a good rule to me. And inevitably, when he talks about French people and Frenchness, he's excluding, for example, people of Algerian origin now living in France. Now, the question is, was this panic, was this closing, battling down the hatches, was it inevitable? Was it only going in one direction? And the answer to that is no. Because there was a second generation of immigrants who were keen to join the prevailing youth culture and to assert their rights to the host country. And the image I've got here on the left is the so-called Marche pour l'égalité et contre le racisme, the March for Equality Against Racism, that went from Marseille in the south of France to Paris in 1983. Otherwise, it was also known as the Marche des Beurs. The Beurs were the North African populations of second-generation ones born in France. But this search for equality and rights was made difficult by the issue of Islam, which arose, as I indicated, in the 1980s, and which created an additional difficulty for integrating Muslim communities. 1989 is a key date. In Britain, we have the case of the satanic verses of Salman Rushdie, which resulted in Khomeini imposing a fatwa on Salman Rushdie, and also there were book burnings that took place in places like Bradford by Muslims of Kashmiri origin, much to the shock of much of the British population. And the picture on the right here is an allusion to the Veil affair in France, when three young women were escorted from a French state school north of Paris. They were told they could not wear the veil in a state school because it violated the French principle of laïcité or secularism, whereby all citizens are equal, but this also means that you cannot express your religious or ethnic origin in a public space, like a school or a town hall. Now, this kind of shock, these shocks of 1989, arguably led to another crisis of French and British identity, which attempted to resolve itself by asserting racial homogeneity and continuous national history, which, as I argued, itself excluded immigrants, non-whites, and people of Muslim origin. I'll give you a quote here from Charles Moore, from The Spectator, 1991. He says, "You can be British without speaking English or being Christian or being white, but nevertheless Britain is basically English-speaking, Christian and white. And if one starts to think that it might become basically Urdu-speaking and Muslim and brown, one gets frightened and angry." And then he says, if Europeans did not have enough babies, he warned, quote, "The hooded hordes will win and the Quran will be taught as Gibbon famously imagined in the schools of Oxford," the schools being where the lectures take place. From another perspective, you have a wonderful comment by Stuart Hall, who said this collection of writings, Familiar Stranger, came out in 2017, although he died in 2014. He says, whiteness remains a signifier of a particular, unique and uninterrupted progressive history, an advanced civilization crowned by a worldwide imperialism. We are this because they are not. They, the blacks in our history, become the constitutive other of this national story. This fantasy of a return to a reconstituted oneness, in inverted commas, and to the elimination of difference tends not to unify, heal or resolve, but on the contrary, it releases pathological impulses. Now, one could argue that this notion of a return to oneness fed into a certain political environment. Arguably, it fed into the hostile environment to immigrants that Theresa May expounded in September 2013, which in turn led to the Windrush scandal of the spring of 2018. And this is a reflection on the Windrush scandal by British Jamaican poet Linton Kwesi Johnson. He said, "I'll be crucified for saying this, but I believe that racism is very much part of the cultural DNA of this country and probably has been since imperial times." And it's interesting, this comment, because he links together racism and imperialism, which is not always done. And one of the messages I'd like to suggest is that when people talk about racism, one has to think about it very often through a sort of colonial lens. The crisis took place not just in Britain but also in France. France, as I said, didn't take part in the Iraq War, but nevertheless there was a lot of agitation among the Muslim population of France, who formed very large parts of the prison population, and the agitation also led to the banlieue riots of October 2005. But there were two responses of the French to this. The first was to pass another law on laïcité, on secularism, in 2004, which tried to clear up the ambiguity about whether women of Muslim origin could wear veils in schools, and the answer was no. But interestingly, that law came more or less at the same time as a law on colonial history, February 2005, which was basically to express thanks to the women and men who took part in the work undertaken in France in its former French departments of Algeria and Morocco. The former French departments of Algeria, plus Morocco, Tunisia and Indochina. So this work, I suppose it's kind of referring to what the French call the civilizing mission, but this civilizing mission meant, holding on to these parts of the French Empire by brute force. But there was an additional article of this law, Article 4, which said that university research programs will give the place it deserves to the history of the French presence overseas, especially in North Africa, and ditto to in schools. And again, it's a euphemism. French presence overseas meant the French Empire. But this article produced an absolute outrage on the part of French academics and intellectuals and other people, and it had to be withdrawn. But in a sense, the damage was done. But this was a rather clumsy but interesting attempt by the French state to say we must put out a very positive history of the French Empire. Now, the last part of the talk. Oh, sorry, I just missed out a bit here. So, so this kind of thinking about the veil and about in French colonial history did produce a backlash, and it produced a very interesting movement called the Les Indigènes de la République, if you like, the natives of the Republic. And this was a movement of French citizens of North African origin, and very often of Muslim origin, who set up an organisation to basically said that they wanted to decolonise the Republic. They said this so-called universal Republic, where everyone's supposed to be equal, is not equal at all, because there is this discrimination. There is what they call a colonial fracture between people of, as it were, indigenous origin and people of immigrant origin. And this is the manifesto of Les Indigènes de la République, where they say that the Republic has to be decolonised, They say that they themselves are the heirs of the French resistance. They are going to take that up. And they say that Dien Bien Phu, this moment when the French armies were defeated in Indochina in 1954, was not a defeat, it was a victory for liberty, equality and fraternity. So the fight went on. So sorry, I'm going to get on to the last part of the talk, which is about how all this relates to Europe, and you're going to get more of this next time from the next speaker. But I'm going to say a few things about it here because, because some of us just can't stop thinking about it. So the empire is not over, and this, as I'm going to try to argue, it shapes our relationship with Europe, and I'm going to try to unpick certain differences between Britain and France in this respect. So this bit is partly comparative, but also French history and British history, as I've tried to show, is also very entangled. So a first point would be that France and Britain had very different pasts. France lost much of its overseas empire in the 18th century, and this was replaced by a continental empire between 1792 and 1815, although it did acquire a second colonial empire at the end of the 19th century. And the picture on the left is of Napoleon at the Battle of Austerlitz, or one of his other great victories. This is the representation of the colonial empire. Britain, however, being an island or an oceanic nation, had an ambivalent relationship with Europe. It intervened there from time to time to prevent a single power like Louis XIV or Napoleon or Hitler from gaining total domination of the continent, but it intervened only to restore the balance of power, and then it came home. And the picture on the left shows Wellington shaking hands with the Prussian general Blücher, who had helped him to win the Battle of Waterloo. The Prussians and the British did it together. Moving on to the Second World War, it's a cliche, but it's probably a true cliche, that Britain had a, quote, good Second World War, while the French had a bad Second World War. France was defeated, occupied and divided, and after the war it tried to restore its greatness, both by holding onto its empire, as I've shown, and by building Europe. In the French case, it wasn't either empire or Europe, it was both and. Britain, on the other hand, was not defeated, not occupied, not divided, and it constructed a myth of standing alone. And this is the famous picture, which I think appeared in the Daily Mail, of the Blitz. And this is, you can see, the statue of the Dome of St. Paul's rising above the Blitz. And it really is a kind of representation of Britain standing alone, as it did in 1941. But of course, it didn't stand alone. It was held without the USA, without Russia, without the Soviet Union, it would have been overrun. But then the story goes, Britain stood alone and then liberated Europe. DDay was the beginning of the liberation of Europe from Britain. And here we have a version of this story that Margaret Thatcher came out with in her famous Bruges speech of 1988. We British have a very special way contributed to Europe. Over the centuries we have fought to prevent Europe from falling under the dominance of a single power. We have fought and we have died for her freedom, and it was from our island fortress that the liberation of Europe itself was mounted. Now this leads to another point, that Britain was never at the heart of Europe, it was always at the periphery. It missed out on the founding moments of Europe in the 1950s and 1960s. It joined the economic community in 1973, but arguably felt this as a humiliation or a surrender, a meagre compensation for losing an empire and for not yet finding a role. It saw Europe as dominated first by France. The picture on the left shows General de Gaulle dressed as Napoleon, being quite lording it over a very diminutive Edward Heath. So the British thought that Europe was either dominated by France, or in the 1980s by Jacques Delors, President of the European Commission, who brought in the Single European Act and wanted to move and pioneered the move towards a single currency. Then, after the reunification in Germany, Britain feared that Europe was going to be dominated by Germany. And here we have the German Chancellor in a sort of Bismarckian helmet. Now, France also was very worried about the reunification of Germany. Mitterrand even tried to stop it. The reunification of Germany provoked reminders of the French defeat at the hands of the Germans in 1870 and in 1940. You saw those pictures of the Germans parading down the Champs-Élysées. But France, unlike Britain, thought the best way to deal with the German problem was to bind it into an ever closer union in the European Union, which is what it did. Now, both in France and in Britain, nevertheless, there was an increase in Euroscepticism, which starts to appear at the time of the Maastricht Treaty in the early 90s and then seems to continue to grow. And I'm not going to read this all out, I'll just give you the... I'm going to compare two speeches. So this is a speech by Nigel Farage, the UKIP Party conference in Birmingham in September 2013, where he says our history puts us apart. So he's talking about this separate national history. He's talking about national sovereignty. He says we get our money back, we get our borders back, we get our parliament back, we get our fisheries back. But when he says something like we get our borders back, this is a kind of allusion to opposition to immigration and the need for racial homogeneity. Now, obviously, in the British case, Cameron offered the referendum. In 2013, Cameron said there would be a referendum if his party won a majority, which it did in 2015, and therefore the rest is history. A similar speech, though, by Marine Le Pen, who was the leader then of the Front National. Similar time, Marseille, September 2013. If you look at the rhetoric, it's pretty much the same as the Farage speech. She talks about a free France as a sovereign and independent France. She says we have to regain control over our budget and over our currency. We have to regain our frontiers at last. That's the anti-immigration thing comes out. And then she says the policy of independence that I proclaim has its models and its previous incarnations that have often covered the history of our country with honour and glory. So she's making a reference to French history. Now, the Front National also did well in the European elections of 2014. But the point is that Macron took her on and defeated her in the presidential elections of 2017. And one of his messages in the debates he had with her was what he wanted was, quote, a strong France in a Europe that protects. So again, it wasn't against, his line was, it's not France versus Europe, it's Europe needs France and France needs Europe, and only France in Europe can protect itself from these outside forces such as Russia, China, and indeed the USA. Now, the last bit of the talk is really about does this matter? I mean, there was a review of my book, and I think the literary review, quite a downbeat review. And one of the points made by the reviewer was, well, did ordinary people care? Did the man on the street or the woman on the street care about empire? Did they go in for this Imperial Nostalgia and Empire 2.0 and Anglosphere, Pirates of the Caribbean? And arguably they didn't. But there is a kind of subconscious, I would argue there's a kind of subconscious, or they talk about it in different ways. And one way they talk about it is, in this way, make Britain great again. So maybe they don't talk about empire as such, but they say, make Britain great again. And this conjures up the idea of Britain being able to go it alone as a great power without being what somebody called a vassal of the European Union. And again, it articulates these three elements. These elements are constantly coming back. The idea of a continuous national history, which is very often about the Second World War, focuses on the Second World War, and ideas of national independence and sovereignty, and ideas of opposition to immigration and notions of national homogeneity, which are sometimes implicit and sometimes explicit. I'll give you two examples. The first example, on the eve of the referendum, 8th of June 2016, 3 generations of a family were interviewed on a council estate in Hull. This was on the Today programme. Now, Hull had an immigrant population of 10%. It was one of the most deprived towns in the country. And we are told that the grandmother, aged 88, was said to have, quote, survived the war. So, immediate reference to the Second World War. Sharon, her daughter, said that she would not vote for Nigel Farage because, quote, you always see the UKIP as racist, but I like when he says that British bit. He's not saying, let's kick them all out. He's saying, stand on your own 2 feet and get on with it. And her husband, Jeff, says, like we used to be, stand by ourselves again. So you've got these elements of national history, opposition to immigration, which is kind of muted or almost denied, but it's there, and then stand on your own 2 feet, the British bit. The second example I've got comes from a former South Wales miner. Now, this relates to the project that Philip mentioned earlier. I've started interviewing miners, and I've started in South Wales. And this guy, there's a guy, Philip James, former South Wales miner, who was actually arrested at Orgreave in 1984. He was obviously lost his job when the mine closed. He did various other pretty rubbish jobs. He was laid off at 50, laid off at 60. He's now 70. I interviewed him last month. He told various stories. He said he was refused a job seeker's allowance because he was receiving a very small miner's pension. And he said, it's not that I'm racist, but I've got the wrong religion and colour scheme. If you just come into the country, they tell you what you can claim and give you advice. But if you've worked all your life, they won't tell you nothing. I see that system as very unfair. They should treat everyone the same. Well, here what he's saying is people who come into the country as immigrants get a better treatment than he is. So in a sense, he feels that racial hierarchies have been upset or subverted, and he says he just wants them to be back as he thinks they can be. When we got on to Europe, he said immediately, I can't wait to get out. To be honest with you, we should come out without a deal. We talked about the elections, of the December elections, when Bridgend, the next door constituency, went from Labour to Conservatives. He said this was because the Labour MP, was campaigning to remain. He said they refused to vote for Labour because they weren't listened to. And his final line was, he said, if the majority has voted to go one way, you should go that way. So if we voted to leave, we leave. And then his final line was, they're refusing to accept what the people are telling them. And that sort of final phrase made a huge impact on me, because what he was talking about, he wasn't talking about empire. He wasn't even necessarily talking about making Britain great again, but he was talking about the people, the British people. And the British people are almost by definition are white British people, because he talked about immigrants. And he says, so this is a kind of version where there's an appeal to democracy. The appeal to democracy, the appeal to what people want has to be observed, and that's the force of the argument. So this is my conclusion. As I said at the beginning, my point is that we have to think through what empire means, again in two particular ways. We have to think through the notion, which I think is a sort of fantasy, but it's a powerful fantasy, that we can stand alone as a world power, independent of the European Union, without being a prey to China, Russia, or the United States. And the danger of going down that road is that because of our imperial past, there is this powerful sense that we have stood alone, and that we can stand alone. And the other thing that we have to guard against is this fantasy of a monocultural nation, which is based on a xenophobia vis-à-vis EU nationals, and a sense of white superiority vis-à-vis immigrants from former colonies. And this also goes back to our colonial past, and again, this is something that we need to rethink, and my book is a small attempt to rethink it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.